I think some of that is really well described in a project that we call Oyster Texture. It started with a genuine interest in thinking about oyster restoration within New York Harbor, learning about the nuances of an individual species, the eastern oyster, why it disappeared from New York Harbor. But just through that investigation of understanding how the life cycle of the oyster did and didn't function in New York, we began to think about different design projects that could help create more habitat for the oyster, create these filtering oyster reefs, and then we began to learn all the other benefits that the oyster has as a keystone species that supports many other organisms within the marine environment, but also as a species that builds reefs and attenuates waves and helps protect shorelines, which is also good for human populations living against the coast or along the coast. And so I feel like the more you begin to dig in and investigate and learn more about even very small, tiny creatures, invertebrates like the oyster, the more you find these larger connections to the human world and the greater world of the ecosystem of New York City. I think in the case of the oyster, we started by just trying to educate ourselves. So we spent a lot of time trying to understand the particular needs of the oyster and the needs of the oyster within the restoration context of the pretty challenged underwater environment of New York, which has been dredged, which has been flattened, and which has been hardened. All the edges have been hardened, so there isn't that kind of textured underwater habitat that once used to exist. So that was a really core piece of the research process. And then as we developed our research and took it into a more formal, built and engineered project called Living Breakwaters, we kind of changed some of those techniques and began to look more carefully at rock substrates and ecological concrete substrates and methods of both releasing oysters into the wild to have more of a oyster spat population, but also creating better surfaces for baby oysters to attach to grow into reefs over time. But the next step of the process too is to get humans involved, right? These systems won't be successful if there aren't human stewards for the system to help advocate for them, to help maintain them, to help monitor them, and to help steward them over time. And so one of the key populations of people that we tried to bring into the project were younger students. This project is meant to be a piece of new habitat and reef creation along the shore, but it's also meant to be a piece of coastal protection infrastructure that should stick around for 30, 50, 70 years. And so, if you think about the timeline of a middle school student growing along with the oyster beds growing within, Staten Island Harbor or Raritan Bay, we wanted to engage that population really early and kind of bring them into the project, help them understand the marine environment that they live in, but also kind of cultivate this whole new generation of bay stewards for the future. And so Living Breakwaters also started as a competition, but then moved into the kind of more serious design process and construction process. And we were able to embed research at many different levels within that process. So a good example of that is we worked with some marine biologists on the team to develop a way that the breakwaters, a monitoring plan for the breakwaters. It's a requirement, a federal requirement for the funding that the breakwaters have a monitoring plan. But we thought about how could we make that a bit more creative and how could we not only study the risk reduction elements of the breakwaters, how much it was protecting the shore and building the beach, but also think about an ecological experiment being embedded within it. And so with Living Breakwaters, the marine biologists developed an experimental layout for our different ecological concrete units and our reef streets. So some breakwaters have reef streets, some do not. And then the different reef streets have different shapes and treatments along their edges that incentivize the growth or the sustenance of different species like shellfish versus juvenile finfish. And so those will be studied over time to see how they perform. So if there are other projects that can learn from these lessons, We want to see these ideas put forward in the world, and other designers and other engineers pick up on them and carry them to their work. So that's been important to us. So I think what public sediment really brought awareness to was that for a very long time we have modified water and sediment systems without really thinking about the implications of those modifications. So we've treated our water bodies as on-off valves that you can simply manipulate and reroute rivers and channelize rivers and dam up tributaries. It takes a while for the systems to respond and to really see the larger scale impacts that are happening. I think what the project really helped push along was it helped visualize a lot of the scientific inquiry happening around the topic. It's a spatial problem as much as it is a quantitative problem. And so we used our skills as landscape architects to begin to try and connect the dots. And so kind of revealing that through drawings, through video, through community conversation and engagement, I think is one of the major pushes that we've been able to kind of help inspire with the project. Many coastal communities along the coast, along our coast, need regulators that are willing to say yes, willing to experiment, and willing to test new types of projects that aren't about pure historic restoration of ecosystems, but are about restoring ecosystem function in a meaningful and genuine way. I think landscape architects are synthesizers and communicators and choreographers of very complex information, very complex inputs. And it's our role, kind of as the project synthesizer, to pull it all together, to help figure out what entities can work together, what serendipity there might be between the needs of a juvenile fish and the needs of an onshore human, right? It's up to us to kind of match make those opportunities. And it's also up to us to think about how the work is communicated and broadcast in the world and shared with people and responded to. And so it's a delicate balancing act, I think. For so many decades and maybe even centuries, we have been working in opposition to the natural systems around us. And we as humans have not been conceiving of ourselves as part of these natural systems and as part of an ecological cycle. And so I think our goal and our vision with our work is to better work with the natural systems around us, be more adaptable, be more responsive, and truly consider us as part of one of these 8.6 million species that exist in the world, and not working against or in opposition or in isolation to. So I think that's our big vision, to work better with and be part of a true urban ecology.